I decided to try out bookbinding last year, and I successfully made my first journal from scratch. I filmed the process to share, but I mostly followed a specific tutorial, so I will link that below in case anyone is interested. I started off by preparing my paper. I went with watercolor because part of my goal last year was to get better at painting with water-based paints, like watercolor and gouache. I went with more affordable student-grade paper, and while it worked just fine for what I needed, I did realize it wasn't the best quality once I started folding the pages in half. I start off by cutting each sheet in half, and then I folded that half in half as well to form the page. At this point, I noticed that the paper was starting to come apart, and thankfully it held together enough to finish the book, but it just wasn't ideal. Here I'm starting to form the signatures, which are basically little groups of pages nestled inside of each other. I went with 2 pages per signature since the watercolor paper was a bit thick, and I think it was about 12 signatures overall. Next, I measured where I would be sewing the signatures together, leaving 1 inch between each point. There are many different ways to do this, but this was just the technique I used. At each point, I used the hole punch to carefully make holes in each signature. It's important to be as careful as possible here because if the holes don't line up, the pages might shift when you're sewing them. Next, I ended up using pre-waxed thread that came with the bookbinding kit that I got. It was really helpful to get the kit, but I realized while sewing that the thread was so thick it was starting to rip bigger holes in the watercolor paper, which, as I mentioned before, already wasn't the best quality. I think it was a combination of the thread being too thick and the wax coating also being too thick. I was able to sew it up fine, but I did have to take my time and be careful to not rip the paper too much. I definitely recommend it if you're on a budget and still learning, because you can get a bunch of it for a pretty good price. Just remember it's kind of fragile when it comes to folding and sewing the pages. Overall, I think it turned out well for a first attempt, but I definitely went and purchased different thread and some wax for the next book. Here you can see the finished text block. I was really excited at this point because it was starting to really look like a book. Next, I started to glue the spine. I used this neutral pH adhesive. It has archival quality and was recommended online. I don't have a book press yet, so I just used what I had, which were these 2 large books and a couple of clamps. I added a couple of layers to glue to the spine and let them dry for about an hour or so. Next, I added a strip of mold to the spine and let that also dry. I forgot to film it, but I also followed up with a strip of thick poster paper, and that was just to add further reinforcement to the spine. Next, I prepared my book boards. I measured out the side of the front and back covers as well as the spine. This was just based off of the size of my pages plus about 1/4 inch. Once those were cut, I figured out where exactly on the fabric I wanted them to go, and then I started to embroider my cover design based off of that. I went with the back stitch for most of the line work and satin stitches to fill in the moon cycle. I also kept it to just white to be simple. I don't really like embroidering without a hoop, so I kept it pretty basic, and I think the design came out pretty cute. I was happy with it in the end. I used a water-soluble stabilizer to place the design on the fabric, so I had to rinse that off and let the fabric dry before continuing to the next step. Here I'm just making sure that the book boards are properly aligned before gluing them to the fabric. I'm using the same glue as before and just carefully gluing everything together. Once the boards are down, I glued down the edges. I left this under a heavy weight overnight to dry. One thing I will mention is that I did not use proper fabric for this. I was having trouble finding affordable book cloth, and I figured I could just use a thicker fabric instead. It wasn't an issue until I started to glue the fabric to the board, and I realized it was bleeding through. The glue ended up staining the cover, It's not the worst thing in the world, but I definitely had to rethink my fabric choice after that. I chose this poster for the inner pages of the book, which will help bind the book board to the text block. I cut out the 2 portions that I wanted and carefully glued them to the book board and the text block. It's kind of hard to describe what I did here, but the tutorial that I link below goes into more detail on the best way to do this. I definitely made a few mistakes here overall, but I was really happy that it at least opened properly and functioned as a book once I finished. This is the finished book. Despite the issues, I think it came out really nice. There are a few places where the fabric did not fully glue down, which is mostly due to the embroidery, and the glue stains are relatively noticeable. You can also see a few wrinkles on the inner pages from the glue dampening the poster, and it is a bit too short on the front. But regardless, I was really happy with it, and it helped me fulfill my goal of painting more last year. I also feel like I learned a lot about bookbinding from just this one project. I will be posting my 2023 journal soon, and hopefully you'll be able to see the improvements I was able to make. Thanks so much for watching, and make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more.